Hi, thank you. So I'm a little bit of an oddball here because I'm not an economist, I'm not a businessman, and I'm not a sociologist. I'm a geophysicist, which begs the question, what am I doing here? I'm here to talk about our new project, Seismic Cities, which is looking at earthquake resilience within cities around the world. And it's a new project, so we don't actually have any results to show you, but I'm going to give you the setting and the context of what we're trying to do. So first I should say, what is an earthquake? Earthquake is a sudden release of a lot of energy that are stored on big fractures in the ground called faults. And we all know what they do. They shake the ground and topple buildings and kill people. But I'm going to start with this, which is essentially a very naive but a simple equation that helps us get started. So what is seismic risk? Seismic risk is a product of the exposure and the vulnerability. And that's a very simplified view of risk, but for our case, it's a good start. And I'm going to be talking a lot about vulnerability here, so in particular social vulnerability. I know that this conference is about resilience, but think of vulnerability as a reciprocal of resilience, and we'll be happy. So first, I'm going to start off with this figure. So I'm showing you a lot of figures, which is better than text, I think, to help illustrate what I'm trying to tell you. In this map is a map of the earthquake magnitude, so the size of the earthquake, and the number of deaths in the earthquake. So what we're trying to do is understand why people die and how people die in earthquakes and what we can do about it. Here we can make the naive assumption that the bigger the earthquake, the more people it kills. And that's a good starting point. And to some extent you can see there's a positive trend here between the size of the earthquake and the number of fatalities. So that possibly is what's happening. However, there's probably more to this story. But is it really so simple? I'm going to show you a couple of examples. This is Haiti in 2010. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake. It killed around 200,000 people in that earthquake. This is the largest earthquake we've ever measured in 1950 in Chile. It was a magnitude 9.5, but it only killed about 2,000 people. And this one in Dalbandin in 2011, also a magnitude 7.1, same size as Haiti, killed -2 people. And you might wonder how you could kill -2 people. Well, the shaking induced 2 ladies to go into labor early, and so they gave birth, so the population increased instead. So obviously there's something else on here. It's not just the size of the earthquake. There's something more to this story. And this is part of the answer. These are all the cumulative deaths from earthquakes in the last 30 years. And you can see that globally that it's not uniform. There are certain regions that disproportionately affect people in these disasters, particularly in this Eurasian region and this South American region. But why is that? Why is this the case? This is part of the answer. This is a map of the global population density around the world, and the circles, the black circles, represent so-called megacities. In this case, the cities with more than 2.5 million people. And if I show these two maps together, you can see there's almost a positive correlation between where people live and where they die. And that makes sense, right? If an earthquake happens in the middle of the Saharan desert, it doesn't kill anybody because there's no one there. But if it happens in a highly populated area, it kills more people because it's higher exposure. But there's more to this than just that. I'm going to compare 2 major events now. Again, Haiti in 2010, but also in New Zealand later on in the same year. And in this earthquake, 1 million people, around 1 million people, were exposed to the high shaking in the event. And in New Zealand, around 350,000. In Haiti, 230,000 people died, so nearly a quarter of the entire population. Whereas in New Zealand, nobody died. A few cows fell over, I think, that was it. But the key thing here is both of these earthquakes are exactly the same size, magnitude. So these earthquakes both affected large populations, but one killed a quarter of the entire city and one killed nobody. So what's going on here? So it's not just a simple exposure issue. And I think this is part of that solution. Here's a map of some of the major earthquakes we've had in the last 30 years against the death and the cost of the earthquake, the economic cost of the earthquake. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Here, this is California in 1994. I think it's called the Landers earthquake. And it killed about 50 people, I believe. But the economic cost of it was about 20-30 billion US dollars at the time, which it sounds like a lot of money, but for California, it was, even 30 years ago, it was less than 1% of the Californian GDP. So although it was a lot of money, it was still only a small percentage of its GDP. Whereas Haiti over here killed about 200,000 people, cost about $10 billion, but that $10 billion is 100% of Haiti's GDP. So what's the story here? The story here is the rich pay and the poor die. So poverty is a crucial factor in the social vulnerability. So the poorer you are, the higher social vulnerability you have to natural hazards, particularly earthquakes. And why is that the case? It's because earthquakes don't kill people. This is a famous phrase. Buildings kill people. And if poor people cannot build their buildings properly, they die in them. Whereas rich people can pay for better buildings, and they don't pay the price with their life. They pay it with the finance, money instead. So poverty is a social vulnerability in this case. Here's another case. This is my pet topic, corruption. This is quite an old paper now, but you can do this. You can play this game with newer data as well. Here is a map of global corruption perception on the left, and the gross national income. And essentially, the dotted line is the model. If you fall on the line, you're just as corrupt as we expected you to be. And if you fall above the line, you're less corrupt than we expected you to be. And if you fall below the line, you're more corrupt than we expected you to be. So the US and UK and Japan, the UK is in the top right. It's not labeled, but it's around next to the US. So those countries, they're just as corrupt as we expected, which doesn't say that they're very corrupt or they're not corrupt. It's just our expectation. Some notable examples in Europe with earthquake countries are Italy, more corrupt than we expected, probably not a surprise to many. Greece, also. Turkey, also. These three countries have high earthquake hazard, and they're also in the lower quadrant of this, lower half of this graph. But also note Chile at the top. I'm going to talk about Chile in a moment as well. And New Zealand at the top. They're less corrupt than we expected, which is a good thing. And Haiti is all the way down here. And why is this important? It's because, this is 2005, the global construction industry, worth 3.5 trillion in 2005, now it's at about 12 trillion, is considered to be the most corrupt segment of the global economy. And again, why is that important? Because if these people are building the houses people live in, and when the earthquake comes and shakes, if it's not built properly, it will fall on you, and then it will kill you. So this corruption is a vulnerability, and one that's not included in modern risk assessments and hazard assessments in cities. And this is the map. This is the latest map of the Global Corruption Perception Index. This is published by Transparency International, the great organization. And in this case, 0 is you're the devil, you're completely corrupt, and 100 is you're the angel. You're an angel. You're absolutely not corrupt. And I can safely say there are no devils in the world, which is great. There's no country with 0, but also there are no country with 100 score. So we're all in the middle somewhere. And the best country in the world is New Zealand and Denmark with a score of 90. And the most corrupt countries in the world are, take a guess, Somalia, North Korea, and Sudan, with scores around 10. But what's important to note here is red is bad. And there's a lot more red than there are yellow on this map. So corruption is a huge problem. And if I was to show you a map of the deaths as well, the distribution of death, you'll see a strong correlation between red and dead. And what's really worrying is 2/3 of all countries in the world fall below 50. 50 being the middle mark, where you're not an angel or you're not a devil, you're middle. So more countries, 2/3 of all countries are more corrupt than not. And this is an important social vulnerability when it comes to infrastructure provision and seismic risk. Okay. And what's the result of this? The result is 83% of all deaths in the world happen in low-income, poor, and corrupt countries. That's what's the response to that. So that's a huge vulnerability on this planet. So I've come up with a method. If you happen to be a corrupt seismologist, I've got a foolproof method on how you can build a building the best way in a corrupt best corrupt way. So you need to know if you're building, you need to know if your area you want to build your power plant is safe. So what do? You ask a seismologist, an earthquake scientist. And if he or she says yes, great, build your dam, build your house, build your power plant. If he or she says no, what do? You ask another seismologist. If they say no, you ask another seismologist. And you keep doing this loop until someone says yes eventually, or you give them a big enough bribe until someone says yes, and then you build your house. And that's what I call the quality assurance loop. It's a way of ensuring you can meet all the regulatory requirements. And for us in the Seismic Cities project, this is the global population the map of all the big cities in the world in 1995. And in 2015, this is what the map looks like. So 54% of all people on the planet now live in urban cities, and that's a great thing. Cities bring people together and boost economic productivity and growth, etc. But it also brings all those social vulnerabilities together as well. So although it increases economic output, it increases their vulnerabilities to certain hazards, particularly earthquakes. And this is what we're going to do in the Seismic Cities project. We're trying to understand the full spectrum of vulnerability and resilience in cities, particularly low-income cities around the world. And our case study is Santiago in Chile. It's Santiago because it's not a low income, admittedly, but it's a fairly resilient city. It works. The social vulnerability is quite low. And more importantly, it's recently had a large earthquake, which we can go and understand and assess the social and seismic social vulnerability and social response during these earthquakes. And what's interesting is that in disasters, you have this common fate effect. Where in disasters, no matter if you hate your neighbors before disaster, after disaster, you will help them. It's what's known as the common fate. Because they share a common event, it brings people together. And that's a form of resilience that's not currently thought about much. People coming together. 95% of all aid immediately after a disaster is done by your neighbors. And that's the form of resilience that we need to promote more. And so my job as a physical scientist is to understand this fault here next to the city. This is Santiago. Next to the city there's this big fault. And we've dug holes across it, and we've shown that it's had several earthquakes in the past, very large earthquakes of magnitude 7.5. And what we can do now is run a simulation. So there's a map of the fault. I can run a 7.5 earthquake simulation across it and see what happens to the city. And this is what happens. This is the map of all the buildings that will collapse in that event. And you can see, not surprisingly, most of it happens along the fault, but also in the central district of Santiago, where all the more dense buildings are concentrated. The buildings are densely concentrated. But around the edges here are where the more vulnerable communities live, where the poor and the poverty, corruption, etc., those issues are, and around the edges here to the west. So that's where a lot of the vulnerabilities are. And in fact, in this event, 70,000 buildings will collapse. And we could do the same. These are the casualty, the death toll. This is where all people will die. And we predict around 4,500 to 5,000 people will die in this if that event were to occur again. And also we can calculate the economic losses. This is just purely from the residential buildings. We expect about $12 billion of US dollars of loss, just purely from the residential buildings. But what we're really worried about now is we're quite good at calculating economic loss just purely from the residential cost. What's really important is how do you value the social loss? Because 5,000 people may die, but 25,000 will be homeless immediately after an earthquake. How do you account for that in our economic models and our models of resilience and loss? And these are things we're thinking about at the moment, and we hope to include in this future for this work.